Okay, so for the sake of staying on time, I'll kick things off. I'm John Parks. I'm a marine scientist with an engineering and scientific firm called Tetra Tech. It's a publicly traded corporation here in the United States. I'm actually based in Asia. My day job's out of Bangkok, and I work in Southeast Asia. So, today I'm here as an enthusiast and less as a corporate representative from an engineering and science firm. And I'd like to talk a little bit about smart growth for Mars. People have heard about smart growth. It's a very divisive term, smart, quote-unquote, growth. We heard this morning, it's been very interesting over the last 10 years to see the shift in the discussion around human habitation and it moving from a transport problem to one of ethics. And we need to be really careful and conscious about this moment as we leave the cradle and head off to our sister planet and then far beyond over the next few hundred years. And as an ecologist, I'm sometimes asked to help think about some of these issues that we've struggled with here and how that applies elsewhere. And so I'm bringing that lens as a marine ecologist, a terrestrial, an earth-based marine ecologist to this discussion. So I'll divide the paper this afternoon into 4 sections. I'll go through an introduction, kind of set things up, and I'll talk about a proposed framework to help us think a little bit about the next few hundred years and how we might wrestle with how we move forward and how we develop Mars. We'll do some discussion. It wasn't working. I turned it on, but
This is just for that. If you want to use the amplified, use this here. No, that's just for me.
Yeah.
Don't worry about that.
Oh, so this is just for the recording.
You're not going to touch it.
All right, sounds good.
But that, you want the amplified?
Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's okay. Yeah, we're small enough group.
Cool. It's more natural.
Right. Yeah. Right. So after I go through the framework, I'll go through a little discussion and come to my conclusion. So we know that here on Earth, we're in the midst of the Anthropocene, which is this period where humanity has deeply changed the terrestrial and marine ecosystems of the planet. We have this biosphere, and as a mammalian species, we've evolved to have a very dominant role in the biosphere. We've really transformed things, and over the last 100, 150 years, there's been an acceleration in that transformation. And as a species, we've in the last 30 years, we've become much more reflective. I think it was really Rachel Carlson's Silent Spring in the 60s, and then the EPA and some new legislation out of the 70s that really sort of gave rise to this public discourse on what does this mean? Our ability to greatly alter geophysical processes, biochemistry, the ecological systems. What does this mean? And now technologically, we're at a place where we're about to leave the cradle and spread across our own solar system. And so this discussion around the Anthropocene and our own reflection of what's happening here is very important for us to pause momentarily and think about prior to leaping. As we hear, there's a lot of enthusiasm, whether you're a billionaire or you're the president of the United States, there's a lot of enthusiasm to leap and to get going. So what we've learned in terms of human experience here on Earth is that as a species inside this really complex adaptive ecosystem, we've learned.
Yes. Is a password on that?
No, I just put in the
Just
flash
logged in?
drive and
Okay.
didn't wave my hand.
Okay.
Sorry.
Thank you.
So one of the things we've learned here on our experience on Earth is that our well-being as a species is deeply and fundamentally, intrinsically tied to the system's health, the health of the natural system around us. And as we begin to understand that direct relationship between human well-being and environmental health, that is something we need to recognize may actually be intrinsic to our species and not to Earth per se. That connection, that link between human well-being and planetary health or environmental health. Right now, our best way to get at that relationship is this internationally accepted, widely adopted, scientifically accredited process of using these, what we call sustainable development goals. So out of the Sustainability Summit in the early 2000s came this agreement for the world's countries to come up with a set of standards for what human development should look like, what fair, equitable, and healthy development looks like. There are 17, after 2 decades of discussion, there's 17 measures or goals. The goals are broad, but within them they have specific metrics and specific ways of measuring progress against each development goal. Some of them are around poverty, others around life, biological life, some are around safe access to clean, potable drinking water, food, equity, just about everything you can imagine in terms of humanity's existence and development here on the planet and how it links to the Earth. It is intended to help guide smart development, smart human development here on Earth. This is the primary purpose of these 17 Sustainable Development Goals, is to guide the development of Earth and human ecosystems. You can think of it as a pause and reflect as we enter into the Anthropocene. We're trying to give ourselves a bit of a framework, a roadmap. This is really important because this framework, these 17 agreed goals, inherently link human well-being with the health of the biosphere, Earth. And this is by design, and it's because of our fundamental understanding of how humanity and its role in the natural system and the natural order of things. So linking our well-being to the well-being of the planetary health is intrinsic in these 17 Sustainable Development Goals that the UN has put forward. I was fortunate enough to be invited as one of several scientists. Again, I'm a marine scientist by background, but I was invited to be part of a working group at the National Center for Ecological Assessment and Analysis and Synthesis, the NCs. This is at the University of California, Santa Barbara up the road. We had a working group. We were put together, funded through the National Science Foundation. We were put together to look at the UN goals, try to think a little bit about how do you actually measure these? How are they measurable? And how specifically do you measure human well-being with the development of Earth? And this is about a third of us. We're all over the planet. That's me on the bottom row with my colleagues from Micronesia and Fiji, Hawaii, where I'm from. But we're all over the world. And we've spent a few years really looking at the analytics, the statistics associated with natural and social measures of human development and the biosphere, and looking at how they correlate to these metrics here. And we find that human well-being is deeply and sort of you almost think if you're a mathematician, tautological. It means that you're actually measuring the same thing. That human well-being is the same thing as the health of the system because they're so closely correlated. And when we started to do this, a few of us started to think, well, if we know that transport is getting solved and people are now, the billionaires are pouring, venture capital is coming in, and we know that humans have now set their sights on the sister planet and beyond, now Enceladus, Europa, Titan. If we know in the next couple hundred years that's going to happen, what does it mean? What have we learned here and how do we apply that in terms of measuring our development as a species in these other systems, these other planetary biomes? And so the challenge we had is maybe build a practical framework of how to measure that and to guide our progress. The word smart is so divisive, I put it in there because it brings you to the topic, right? You see smart, we're going to think, what does this guy know, right? So smart meaning that it's informed, it's adaptive, and it is based off of empirical evidence. And, going from Earth to interplanetary. So our hypothesis, our assumption is that maybe that relationship between human well-being and the health of the natural system here is actually not unique to Earth. It might actually be about us more than anything. So I'd like to just share the framework with you. Before I do that, a key definition. So one term that I'll be using is called socio-ecological systems. SES is the short for socio-ecological system. And you can define this as a biogeographical unit with all the actors, the human beings and their institutions inside, and all the natural resources and how they manage and interact within this biogeographical unit. Now, a unit could be a biosphere, or it could be a small ecosystem, or even an urban center. These are I'm an ecologist. From an ecological perspective, these are complex and adaptive systems. They're emergent, and you don't know what's going to happen. they're stochastic, they go through their own ups and downs on their own, and they go through, perturbation, natural disturbance, and at the end, they sort of equalize and they're able to self-sustain, and that's what makes them complex and adaptive. So a wetland is a really good example of a complex adaptive system. So are oceans, where I spent my career, or even a biome like Mars, which people say is dead. We're not sure about that, but give it a couple hundred years, it will not be dead, because humans are going to terraform it. And so we really have to think about this. Don't take my word for it. Dr. Elinor Ostrom won the Nobel Prize for this, right? So this is not my work. This is a whole body of knowledge around how human beings interact in these socio-ecological systems and how there are emergent properties that occur. And she really threw out the tragedy of the commons, the Malthusian Model, where you have scarcity and competition, and she proved, and this is why she won the Peace Prize, she proved that even in the most remote settings, human beings have a tendency to work together and collaborate when resources are scarce and times are tough. We are very good at making sure that we persist. And that socio-ecological system is something that is good for the system, and it's also good for us. So it's feedback. So I'm going to present some assumptions. To have a framework, you have to have some assumptions of what the framework is operating under. Now, because we're talking about Mars and settlements, we have to put out many assumptions. Now, obviously, these are dynamic systems that change through time, so we can't just talk about one point in time. I've arbitrarily almost cut this into 3 different time frames. The first is initial colonization. You can think of that as the first 25 years or 25, 30 years. That's the first generation, if you will. After that initial colonization, you might have some actual permanent settlement, people actually settling down and might having children, and maybe a second generation is coming. So maybe from that second generation out to, let's say, 10 generations, where after 250 years, 300 years, you have sustained human settlement. You have people who are able to technologically and through a whole lot of mortality, they've survived and figured out how to survive. And so under these 3 different, almost arbitrary divisions of settlement, we have to think about how these measures of how human development will occur is going to be different through those periods of time, because it's going to be fundamentally different. And like I said, I was very fortunate to be part of this working group, and what I'd like to propose is the following, which I believe are reasonable assumptions. On the environmental, if you think of the environment of Mars, both in terms of the biological diversity, which is 0 to very little right now, during initial colonization, maybe 250 years later, we've introduced enough bioware that there's actually a fair degree of diversity, maybe a low to moderate degree of diversity, and after 200, 300, 400 years with bioengineering and genetic modification, we may actually see an emergent adaptive system of its own, adapting on its own. Similarly, those complex ecosystems, right now and for the next, at least next 50 to 100 years, that's going to be a fairly static system that we're going to have a lot of influence over. Eventually, those systems may take hold and become dynamic on their own. Habitability right now is, as you hear, is a very hostile environment. Mars is a tough place to live. We've all heard these stories. It doesn't mean that humans aren't going to go and attempt it, but we know that the habitability or the ability to persist on the surface, whether it's through radiation or cold exposure, the fact that the atmosphere is so thin, there's many things working against us. But with terraforming and time, we can assume that will improve over generations and with a few hundred years. And then finally, that the dependency on natural resources will be Earth-based for a lot of this settlement period. We'll have to import basically all the bioware to Mars, bring a lot of it, and then with time, that dependency will decrease. Socially, again, these are socio-ecological systems, to use Dr. Ostrom's Nobel Prize-winning research. That social component is really important as well. And this is where we have the social and political influence of Earth will be very paramount. We'll talk about planting flags and all these things that in Ostrom's framework is very relevant, the institutional and governance bodies that are overseeing resource control. Certainly, during initial settlement, that would be very important. With time, we may see a divergence away from that level of high influence by Earth on those systems where humans are persisting. Similarly, economic independence, there's a high level of dependence early, but eventually that independence will grow, particularly if there are resources in the asteroid belt that are being mined and taken advantage of closer to Mars. Human augmentation, obviously Mars is not subject to the same rules that we have here, except the ones that we take with us. And so I think we have to be, we already know that there's human augmentation and genetic modification of humans underway right now. We heard last year in China. We're not here today I'm not here to pass judgment. That's not my job as an ecologist. I'm just observing what's happening. And certainly this is likely to occur on Mars. And mortality rate is going to be very high. Those initial years prior to figuring out radiation, the atmospheric pressure, the very caustic soil with all the all the things that are going to kill you in there, so mortality rate's very high. You're unlikely to survive very long on Mars for quite a while. And then finally, human well-being overall is going to be pretty low. In fact, a few of my colleagues, they said to me, John, we shouldn't even talk about human well-being in the case of leaving the planet. Really, human well-being is limited or restricted to Earth. I disagree, but I know that thought process is out there, that this is Eden. We have no place out among the stars because human well-being is not applicable there. And I disagree, but I think it is something that people feel very strongly about. We heard this morning. And then so basically you have a hostile environment for the near term that becomes more tolerable with 10 or 15 generations later, you can tolerate it. That's technology and human evolution, the biosphere of Mars being terraformed and becoming more tolerable. So if we assume this, which I think is fair to assume, I had some peer review on this framework, then there are some things we have to think about. If these conditions or something similar holds over the next 300 years in the socioecological system, then in the second table I'm going to show you, these are 7 factors, or really these are development goals for Mars that we really need to start discussing now, right? If there are some group of people who are planning on going, we should talk about these 7 things. These first 7 factors apply across all 3 time periods. They're not unique to just one time period. First is human persistence. This is the ability of humans to survive. This is the basic objective, is human survivorship, persistence on the planet. This is everything from potable water, breathable atmosphere, it's a long way off, to reduced radiation, which if you're underground, that helps. Also just growing and persisting our bioware, bringing from Earth what we deem as valuable protein, vegetable, the food sources, and growing them successfully underground. This will happen throughout Mars's colonization, but especially initially, it'll be really early before we build that atmosphere up and get some radiation shielding. This will really, growing on the surface is going to be very limited unless it's heavily genetically modified. There are analogs to the Sustainable Development Goals. These are 14 and 15. 14 is life below water. 15 is life above surface. This is the Earth analog. Obviously, the natural planetary conditions of Mars. This is an inverse correlation. Here, we're trying to keep Eden. It's going to be the opposite on Mars. We've heard people talking about pumping carbon and nuking the poles and all kinds of pretty outlandish things to create atmosphere and then, to grow and terraform the planet. This is not just geochemical and but it's also ecological eventually. There are, again, the life below water and the life above land, those UN analogous goals for developing Earth, they apply here on Mars, and we need to think about that. The availability of credible, safe, and reliable energy sources. There's a lot of speculation. I think it's going to have to be a mix of energy. But what's our goal for this? What's the objective here? How do we build this out over that period of colonization? Scientific engineering, are we going to allow GMOs? Are we going to allow human augmentation, accelerated evolution? Are we going to bring in, introduce species and highly modify them? And if so, then how do we do that? Are there ways that we should look at doing this? Should we be thoughtful about this? Probably, because again, human well-being and the well-being of Mars, eventually its natural systems will be intricately linked. The infrastructure and the surface development for industrialization, this is going to be really important up front, which is why it's one of the 7 that makes it up front. These last 2, the scientific, technological innovation and infrastructure development, these are both analogous to the Sustainable Development Goal by the UN under number 9, which is technology, innovation, and infrastructure for Earth. The rule of law, governance, how are these systems, these settlements going to be governed? At the outset, it may be by nation states, but 300 years later, probably a few revolts, it may be very different. Earth may not actually govern those systems. And so what does that look like? Should we think about this? Probably. Probably now is a good time before we head out. So these first 7 suggested development goals or objectives, these factors, are something that we should really think about. And we've learned this from our own experience here on Earth. If we look at permanent settlement, this is beyond that 2nd, 3rd, maybe 6, 7, 8 generations later, as you approach 250, 300 years later. There are a few factors that only start to apply at that point forward. First is around the introduction of biota, and this is bringing biota above ground. So by this point, the prevailing argument is that there'll be enough atmospheric pressure and there'll be enough terraforming underway after about 300 years where you can actually start to introduce some modified organisms from Earth that are suitable for the in-transformation conditions that are going to occur on a terraformed Mars. Similarly, economic growth by this point is you're out of that initial reliance, high reliance or full reliance on Earth's economic systems. You begin to build some independence economically, particularly if you have an associated industry with asteroid belt mining and extracting resources and processing them on Mars or near Mars. And then the bioengineered ecological succession. This is as an ecologist, and working for an engineering firm. This is where we get pulled in. Is what does it mean to bioengineer essentially a dead body or pretty close to it and bring it to life? How do you do this? I've spent a lot of my career working in restoring marine ecosystems that were dead and bringing them back, and so we've got a fair idea of some of the process that's involved when you bioengineer and you create something that was not there, and you grow it. So that process of terraforming really will kick in during this transformational years, and by the time that there's atmosphere and things start to really take off ecologically, and there's a succession that's occurring, natural succession, adaptive radiation, and you have species being able to adapt and migrate on their own, then we can say that we're in a fundamentally different place than we were during the initial introduction phase. And there are 3 final factors before I go into my conclusions that are important for us to think about. Now it's a little early. This is probably post. This is after we're settled and we're starting to persist. First is really equity. Social equity is something that often, if you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, or you look at social theory, often you got to satisfy safety, food, shelter first before you start to add equity. But we know that this is really important. In a values-based Earth framework, this has 2 Sustainable Development Goals by the United Nations, and that a lot of time and money is spent on the next hundreds of years. There'll be a lot of effort put into equity. And so we have to think about that. What is this? How does this apply off-world? Do we want to build that equity from the outset? What does that look like? How do we eventually get to full ethnic, genetic, gender, demographic, social, socioeconomic equity? What does that look like? It doesn't exist yet, but will it exist in 2 generations on Mars? And how do you get there if that's the case? And we've heard some philosophers start to talk about Mars as a great equity experiment to see if humanity is capable of it. The sustainable production piece, we heard a little bit of this morning, some pushback on preservation and conservation, but as an ecologist, I can tell you that food webs are great when they can sustain themselves. When a prey item is able to reproduce fast enough for the predator to eat it, you're good. So as we begin to build these systems that our reliance on Earth wanes, we're going to need to create natural systems that have enough production on their own that we can draw from it without problem. And this is not political, this is just pure energy transport, right? From an ecological perspective, it's just about energy transfer. And each time you move up that food pyramid, you lose a lot of energy. So you really have to think about this if we're going to start terraforming and building these systems, we need to start thinking about this now. And finally is getting that well-being. And maybe at this point, maybe 10 generations in, 250, 300 years, we can start talking about well-being on Mars and poverty alleviation. So this is an initial framework that we're putting forward. There's all 13 factors here that are laid out, the first 7 being applicable to all 3 phases, and the remainder being split among the last 2. Against the 13 proposed factors, the idea is to characterize this socioeconomic system, socio-ecological system. On Mars, you could probably apply something similar. It'll be a little different if you're going to Titan or living in the oceans of Enceladus, but something similar. We'll see increasingly more similar frameworks as humanity spreads. These are pretty dynamic and complex systems. I mean, one of the reasons Ostrom won her Nobel Prize is because she was able to characterize how complex, mathematically, using statistic Bayesian models, she was able to characterize these systems and how they function, and they're predictive. You know, this is not random. These things are predictive, and you can see them emerge through time. They have their highs and lows. They're stochastic, but they're predictive, and you can track them through time. And this will apply when we leave the cradle, leave Earth. These models will apply. The most important thing I think that these measures do is it helps us now to really think about linking our human health with the health of interplanetary systems. Not Earth, but in this case Mars. The health of Mars is pretty dire right now, so it might be more of an ability to sort of bring life to Mars. And maybe we can use this to really think about how we're going to develop interplanetary bodies like Mars. How are we going to develop these systems? How do we begin to look at the socio-ecological system and begin to program for that? Just in closing, a couple of thoughts here. Short term, we need to really measure these factors. We need to really systematically, empirically go through and measure them, just like we're doing here. As we start to move off, someone needs to carefully measure, at each point of our colonization needs to measure these systems. That way we can learn from our experience and begin to adapt. And that's where that encouragement of smart growth happens. More long term, that means that durable interplanetary human presence begins to build off of that past experience. It's not if we go, it's more how far do we spread and what's the best conditions that our species begins to spread. And what are the conditions that we should spread versus not spread as a species. This will be deeply linked to our own well-being as a species and making sure that that is a good fit for a natural system that will be terraforming. That interplanetary transformation will probably be as important of a legacy to us as any of our technologies that we're leaving behind. Just to close, I really think that Ostrom's approach of looking at socio-ecological systems is an important thing for us to do now before we get on the Starship and land on Mars. We need to start thinking about how and what we're going to be doing, what the rules of governance will be. And we really need to realize not all of our values here on Earth are going to apply there. In fact, we may find that a lot of our political and economic and sort of ethics here on Earth may not completely equate when we're in other interplanetary systems. And we have to be open to this, even if it feels uncomfortable. We have to be open to the idea that our understanding of the socio-political systems and ethics here on Earth may not necessarily translate 100% elsewhere. And we have to be open to this. We have to be objective and critical. I just want to acknowledge my colleagues. I mentioned NCs at the beginning of the talk. My colleagues at NCs, of course, National Science Foundation, and a couple of my peer reviewers. As we head out beyond the cradle, we need to be really careful and thoughtful. There's no doubt that we will, and I'm confident that if we give it some thought, we can do it in a way that we're very proud of when the time comes to look back on our legacy. Thanks.